Rivals are what make college football. Most play for bragging rights, few play for conferences, fewer still play to be the very best. All play for the humiliation of the other. War on turf, one that began 154 years ago, between two teams in the Garden State of New Jersey. The first football game was played in New Brunswick, New Jersey, between students of Princeton and Rutgers, and the very first rivalry was born. To describe this game in the way today's game is described is practically impossible. There's no play-by-play, and the game is so alien to what college football is today that a play-by-play wouldn't even be necessarily helpful. Being much more in sequence with its immediate predecessors, mob football and rugby. The ball could not be held or thrown, but could be kicked with either a player's feet or hands. Each team of 25 would aim to kick the ball through the opponent's goalposts at the end of each field. Each score gained a single point. After each score, the game would end and restart, and the first full college football matchup consisted of 10 games. Rutgers would win 6-4. Originally, the 1869 season, consisting of only Princeton and Rutgers, was meant to have 3 matchups, but after Princeton took care of business the next week, the universities would cancel the third game, either due to a rule disagreement or to give the athletes some study time. Whatever the case may be, the two teams finished with a final record of 1-1, and both would retroactively claim a national title for the very first college football season. Thankfully, they'd be given more than one season to determine a winner. And, oh, sweet Jesus. What happened? There are one-sided rivalries, and then there's this. 33 games in a row over the span of 68 years. The third most wins over a single opponent in a row, only beat out by Nebraska, Kansas, and Notre Dame Navy for the most desperate stretch of games between two opponents in the 154-year-long history of college football. The life expectancy of an average person in 1869 was 40 years, meaning the average person born in 1869 would never see Rutgers beat Princeton. Generations would live, bring in the next, and die, and the Scarlet Knights would never be able to beat the Tigers. The game of football would evolve in the background of each and every one of these bludgeonings. You can see the first parts of the streak were fairly close, low-scoring affairs. This is mainly due to the sport still being in its primordial state, where it began back in 1869. In the mid-1870s, the sport would begin to be more recognizably American football. Eventually, you could hold the ball, run with the ball, there were touchdowns, lines of scrimmage, the 25-man squad would decrease down to 11, and later you could even throw the ball. These innovations would increase scoring, and as a result would increase how much Rutgers got shit on, culminating in these two games here. 80-0, and 82-0 the next week to hammer it home. That Princeton team would be inches away from a perfect season before falling to Walter Camp's Yale to end the season. Rutgers would be inches away from a winless season, tying Stevens and beating Ridgefield Athletic Club to notch their only 2 non-losses of the season. This is how the rivalry, if you could even call it that, was for 68 long years. Rutgers feeling obligated to schedule Princeton, and Princeton feeling obligated to destroy Rutgers. Rinse and repeat around once every 2 years. To be fair to Rutgers, though, not many teams could compete with the Ivies. Being the originators of the sport, the Ivy League teams were able to get their roots down first, becoming not just the forefront of innovation for American football, but the sport's first elite programs. Rutgers, despite also being there from the beginning, did not see the same success the Ivies did during this early era, in no small part due to Princeton becoming the state's premier program instead. To beat an Ivy became a sort of rite of passage, not just for a program, but for the region it resided within, a means of winning legitimacy. When the 1894 Michigan Wolverines beat Cornell, Great Lakes football became more legitimized. When John Heisman's 1917 Georgia Tech shelled Penn in Atlanta, Southern football became more legitimized. Rutgers, on the other hand, would take until 1938 to beat Princeton again. At the grand opening of Rutgers Stadium, 22,000 people gathered to witness something unusual. A good Rutgers team. 1 game short of their first undefeated season, the Scarlet Knights would enter their brand new $1 million stadium in hopes of finally, after 33 games, taking down their in-state rivals. Despite going up 18-13 early, the Princeton offense would stall in the second half, allowing for the upset to finally, after generations, finally occur. The reaction from Rutgers faithful was about what you would expect, with Piscataway erupting in a celebration 68 years in the making. How did it happen? Well, there's the reasonable explanation. Princeton was having a down year and their pass defense was weak enough to allow for Rutgers QB Hasbrook McCormick to outgame them through the air. And then there's the right answer. In the same year of 1938 and the same month of Rutgers' final victory, the final original Princeton Tiger, Robert Lane, would pass away. It was as if this presence of the 1869 team loomed over the Knights, and with the passing of its last member, Princeton's final link to the first game passed with them. In the crowd was another member of that game, Rutgers' final surviving member, George Large, who would pass away shortly after Lane the following year. He held on just long enough to see his team, his legacy, pull out one more win. The 1938 season would turn out to be a signifier for what was to come. Never again would the Princeton-Rutgers rivalry be as one-sided as it was during the 33-game streak, though to call it balanced would be a bit of a misnomer. As the game would evolve, the prestigious luster the Ivies would hold in the world of college football would also begin to fade. With the establishment of a strong pro football league and the increased commoditization of the intercollegiate sport, the Ivy Leagues would begin to fall behind what would become college football's blue bloods. College football's original hegemons would not go down without a fight, however, with the league's last powerhouse being assembled in 1950 in North Jersey. The Princeton Tigers of the early 50s would amass a final record of 26-1, 2 top 10 finishes, a share of the 1950 national title, and averaged 35.4 points per game through a brutally dominant rushing attack. Led by star halfback, kicker, and quarterback Dick Kazmaier, one of the forefathers of the dual-threat quarterback, and assisted by a pair of All-American offensive linemen Holland Donnan and Redmond Finney. They'd begin the decade with a 66-0 shutout of Williams, before hosting the Scarlet Knights. Despite being clear favorites, the Tigers would soon find themselves in a dogfight, entering the second half only up by 7. Yet a costly fumble to open the third would send the Knights further and further back, and despite a late comeback attempt, the Tigers would remain on top to notch their second of eventually 21 straight wins. It's performances like this that would eventually get Kazmaier the 1951 Heisman, the third and final Ivy Heisman. Princeton's reign of terror would continue until 53, when Kazmaier, Donnan, Finney, and the old order of college football finally left, and Princeton fell back to earth with a 5-4 season, never again to reach the heights once reached. It was like the curse of the Bambino. I could understand the curse had haunted the Red Sox. Trading Babe Ruth certainly deserves some sort of punishment, but it's hard to figure out what it was about Rutgers that would induce it. These are the words of Alex Kroll, Rutgers center from 1959 to 1961. And he was right. Despite playing smaller northeastern schools, despite playing on average 9 games a season, despite being right there with the Ivies at the beginning of the sport, never in the history of the Rutgers Scarlet Knights would a team go undefeated. Princeton has done it, many times in fact, but for some accursed reason it couldn't be done here. Until the arrival of John Bateman. Despite having 0 head coaching experience prior to 1960, he'd bring the Knights within 2 points of their very first undefeated season, beating Princeton by 4 but falling to Villanova. Kroll promised that 61 was the year, and the only thing that could stand in their way was Princeton. Despite Princeton yet again having a down year, they'd have to play them at Princeton, and the added difficulty would make itself apparent when the Tigers drew first blood in the second quarter, with the Knights storming back to make it an odd 8-7 game. The second half was more of the same, a defensive slugfest until Rutgers would, once again, reach the end zone deep in the fourth, hit another 2-point conversion, and effectively ice the game, despite a final attempt to come back from the Tigers. In front of 41,000, Rutgers had begun its march to perfection. The rest of the season would hardly be as close as Princeton. 35-12 to UConn, 20-6 to Penn, 27-19 to Delaware. The final challenge would come against Columbia at home, And despite being down 19-7 by the end of the third, they'd storm back with a 25-point fourth quarter, locking down their first undefeated season then and there. Alex Kroll would be honored as an All-American. They'd finish the 1961 season as one of two undefeated teams, the other of which being Alabama, and achieve a final rank of 15 in the AP poll. The 1961 season would cap off a brief era of Rutgers' New Jersey dominance, one that'd end the following season with a Princeton 6-game winning streak. Nevertheless, the rivalry was beginning to finally even out, become competitive, before taking its final step into Rutgers' dominance. Shortly before their 22nd matchup, there is something wrong. A cannon. It's gone. There are 3 cannons on the campuses of Princeton and Rutgers, 2 dated to the Revolutionary War, Princeton's Cannon Green and Little Cannon, and 1 dated to the War of 1812, Rutgers' Big Cannon. The Princeton-Rutgers football rivalry was, in actuality, nothing but a byproduct of these 3 cannons, for the true rivalry between these universities began in 1836, when a local militia stole Big Cannon for Princeton. Rutgers, in an 1875 bid to steal it back, stuck onto Princeton just to find out that it was too big to lug back, opting to steal Little Cannon instead. What followed was a raid, some heated negotiation, and finally the return of Little Cannon, with Big Cannon still residing on Tiger soil. In 1846, Rutgers students would yet again try to steal the cannon, this time with a Ford, and would turn up back to campus cannonless and carless. Then, right before the 1971 game, the cannon would disappear, with a 4x5x5 hole in its place. Turns out, the cannon was fine, it had just been buried, and Rutgers would close out the cannon-burying season with a Princeton blowout, ending yet another chapter in the war for this cannon that not only began this entire rivalry, but one that will continue to exist in the background of each and every one of these games. It's 1975 and Rutgers, for the first time since the late 50s, controls the Garden State, currently on a streak of 4-2-1, including the series-only tie, one that was caused by Rutgers fans storming the field before the end of the game. Ensuring Princeton couldn't pull ahead with a PAT, Princeton is looking for revenge, and perhaps to right the ship back towards the Tigers' favor. And despite falling behind early, the Tigers would eventually pull out a win, 10-7. It would be the final time Princeton would come out the victor against their northern rivals. During the 60s and 70s, universities like Princeton were falling into economic hardships, and austerity measures were needed to maintain the prestige of the university. Football is an expensive sport to play, an even more expensive sport to be competitive in, and the Ivies were becoming less and less willing to maintain their historical competitiveness. The reasoning, outside of temporary economic troubles, can be found in what a college football program, at its core, is. In its most practical sense, a football program does 2 things for a university: generates revenue and promotes the university. Big-time programs, especially as the sport has evolved from the mid-20th century to the late 20th century, prints millions for a university through ticket sales, concessions, and television rights. Most programs, however, don't have this kind of sway and run at a deficit. This deficit is made acceptable due to the advertisement a football program, especially a successful football program, can provide for a university. This is why schools put so much into a football program, and why the Ivies found they didn't really need to do so anymore. What advertising does an Ivy League school need? They're so ingrained in American culture as prestigious universities that American culture essentially promotes them for free. Not to mention the sizable portion of non-American alumni that could not care less about American football. And with Ivy endowments growing at an exponential rate, the monetary desire for a football program would leave too. All that was left was a traditional desire to keep them, to keep college football's fertile crescent alive. A desire that Princeton's century-long rivalry with Rutgers did not fit into. Rutgers is not an Ivy. It's a good school, but it's New Jersey's land-grant public school. The advertisement potential, along with the monetary potential of having a good football program, was still there. The Tigers and Knights found themselves at an impasse. First, future matchups would be canceled by Rutgers on behalf of playing Alabama and Penn State. And then, at last, the series was canned. Princeton's officials noted that Rutgers' move to become a big-time college football program put them, quote-unquote, out of Princeton's desired class of competition. And it was done. 1980 would be their final matchup, with Rutgers blowing out their old rivals 44-13. A week later, they'd play number 1 Alabama in Giants Stadium and miraculously be within 4 points of an upset. This was the football Rutgers wanted to play, big games against big brands, and it was a kind of football Princeton could no longer keep up with. Soon after, Princeton would move to the newly formed FCS along with the rest of the Ivies, officially ending college football's first rivalry. The Princeton-Rutgers rivalry is not an amazing rivalry. It's not close, it lacks impactful matchups, yet it was the first. Every other heated matchup, every other hatred-filled pageantry, every rivalry, the best and least of them, come back here, to a New Brunswick field over 150 years ago. A war on turf that continues to this day.